Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have a wonderful interview with the author Howard Andrew Jones, who wrote the brand new novel Lord of a Shattered Land. This is the first book in the Chronicles of Hannibal series. It was published by Baen Books and released in August of 2023. Mr. Jones, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me on.
So, the first question I had was if you could give us a general pitch or a general idea of what the book is about.
Well, the elevator pitch is really short. It's what adventures would Aragorn have had if Sauron had won?
Right?
You think that's a fair summation of it, sort of? I mean,
Yeah,
it gets
I
close.
yeah, I think so. I think that's a good I didn't necessarily have Aragorn in my mind, although I think that's a good analogy. I was thinking of maybe more like it I wasn't thinking of a fantasy character because I had Hannibal in my mind so
Sure,
clearly.
sure.
So that's who I really clearly saw in it.
Right. Well, unfortunately, when I say Hannibal, I often have to say not the mass murdering cannibal guy.
Right, right.
Right, which ruins my argument. But if I say, well, he's based off of Hannibal of Carthage, and to a history person, they might be like, oh, I can give you the longer pitch if you'd like to give the
Yeah.
audience an idea. Sure, sure. So, picture an ancient Mediterranean vibe, right? Gladiator, Spartacus, all that good
Hmm.
stuff. So, um, when the Dervan Empire came for the city of Volanus at last, its people fought block by block, house by house, until most of them fell with swords in hand. Less than 1,000 survived to be taken away in chains. The Dervan Empire looted the treasuries. They set fire to the temples. They sowed the ground with salt. Their destruction was absolutely complete except for one small factor. The greatest Volani general had escaped alive. And now, against the might of a vast empire, Hanavar has only an aging sword arm, a lifetime of wisdom, and the greatest military mind in the world bent upon a single task. No matter where his people have been taken, from the furthest outpost of the empire to its rotten heart, he will find his people, every last one of them, and he will set them free.
Man, that's fantastic. I heard you give that on another podcast, and I thought you were reading it off of a script, but now you just did that unprompted. So, man, that was fantastic. Way to go.
Well, thank you. I'm passionate about the character and the story. I really want to tell these stories.
And this is set to be a 5 book series in total, correct?
It's set to be 5. I'm really hoping the first few do well because I know how to take it to 7. So
That'd be good. I know a lot of great 7 book series. So the as we alluded to, the book really has a lot of similarities to the Rome and Carthage conflicts, and specifically to the character of Hannibal. What was the inspiration for that, and what sparked the idea to have the paths of the characters kind of follow that same idea?
I've been fascinated with Hannibal since I was about 16, and you can probably see that the hair's gray and receding. So that's been a long while. I just thought, look, there's always stories about great generals, Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Genghis Khan, and they always have interesting ways to overcome their challenges. But I found Hannibal particularly interesting because, unlike so many of the great generals who were all about the conquest and after territory, there was much more to it than that. We kind of give him short shrift when we review him in our history courses because, oh yeah, he crossed the Alps with the elephants. He was going to invade Rome. Well, he invaded Rome, but it wasn't really he didn't expect Italy to become a Carthaginian colony. He knew that if he didn't stop the Romans, he planned to fight them to a standstill and then sue for peace. He knew that if he didn't stop the Romans, eventually they would come for his people. And they did. 50 years after his death, Carthage was famously obliterated, and the ground was sowed with salt, and the people were sold into slavery. So the whole thing came about. I'd been reading about Hannibal for fun for decades, and it finally occurred to me, like, what would have happened if Hannibal had been alive when the Romans came for Carthage? But he wasn't there. What would he have done? And I thought, well, that's kind of a neat story. Has anyone done it? I couldn't find that anyone had. And so then I thought, well, I'd like to do that, but I don't want to be held by history. I want to play fast and loose. There weren't emperors yet. This was Republican Rome, right?
Right.
So I wanted emperors and I wanted gladiators and I wanted dark sorcery. And I thought about all the things I wanted to add in. So then it definitely became a secondary fantasy world. And so since it was that, the Mediterranean isn't exactly the Mediterranean. The cultures aren't exactly the same, and et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah,
there's,
I noticed that the map almost looks like a reversal of the Mediterranean, where Gibraltar, or what would be Gibraltar, seems to be on the eastern side, whereas what seems to be more like the Holy Land area seems to be on the western side. So
right, right.
I like that you did that little flip. I know that other authors have done similar things where Robin Hobb, for her land of the Elderlings, Realm of the Elderlings, she just took the map of Alaska and turned it upside
And
down.
turned it upside down. I think I remember her talking about that. I originally had it even looking a little bit more like it, but my son drew the map. I have a really lousy sketch line around here somewhere, and Darian was like, "No, no, Dad, you could do better. Here, try this." Like, oh, that's great. It's like, how about you do this, Dad? It's like, oh, that's great. So let the map got partly shaped by my son's clever ideas.
Yeah, you didn't even have to go outside the family to get that. That's pretty nice.
Yeah, yeah.
So with that historical element in mind, did you have to do a lot of research? Did you have to read a lot of books about the conflicts, or had you already known them ahead of time that it just folded in?
Well, okay. So there's two answers to that question. The first is, as far as Hannibal and his personality and the flow of his life. God, I've been accidentally researching that for years because I just found it so fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I needed to sort of refresh my memory of the Roman civilization and what day-to-day life was like and all that. So that required me to go back to my bookshelf. I have a pretty vast historical collection, but then of course I can play fast and loose with this because I decided not to do actual historical fiction. So I don't have to get the details exactly right, then I won't get angry letters. I can say, oh, well, that really only occurred in the 3rd century AD, but you know what? That's so cool. I'm going to use it, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera, et cetera. Or Romans never did that. Well, I'm going to do it anyway because that's interesting to me.
Yeah, that seems to be a theme with when you take something that could have been historical and make it fantasy, is you're drawing from history, but you're not necessarily beholden to it. That's what I recently interviewed Gregory Frost, who wrote Reimer for Bane,
Sure.
and he talked about how he used some historical stuff of the famous Thomas the Rhymer, but there were other historical figures. He was like, you know what? If I use this will be cool too. And so you're by doing this, it leaves the creativity to be much more open and free. So I like that.
Oh, that allowed me the freedom. I could use analogs of real historical figures, but then they can walk shoulder to shoulder with people who never ever existed, who are equally important in this world. Yeah.
So the book flows really interesting because even though it's chapters, it's 14 chapters, it really reads more like a short story collection that is tied together with like a plot narrative throughout, but each story is kind of singular. To me, this reminded me of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories from back in the day. But this is kind of classic, but at the same time, it's kind of refreshing because it's not used that often. So, what was the decision making process behind going with this route as opposed to just a traditional novel?
Well, I grew up reading some of the older heroic fiction stories, and so when I began to picture this, it naturally set itself up like that. Poor Robert E. Howard never got the chance to assemble his stories, and he didn't actually get to write them in order. He'd write one set at this time period, another set at this time period. So those stories were assembled by other hands. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool to actually assemble it uh, myself and order it in the way I'd wanted? Then I thought of, well, a modern television series, each episode, not all, but many modern television series, the episodes stand alone, but they build toward a
Mhm.
greater whole. And I think you'd probably agree with me that while the 14th episode could stand alone, that one in particular isn't going to be nearly as enjoyable if you haven't read the ones before,
Right.
right? Because it's sort of like the season climax.
Hmm.
So as I began to structure the entire series, I began to think of them as season one. If you were to peer inside my notebook where my notes are, you would see I call it season one, season two,
Nice.
season three, right? So it was a little game I played with myself. Each story had to be able to stand alone until the climax, but I wanted each one to be a little bit better if you actually read them in order, just as it would be with a TV series. So, some characters are introduced here and they'll return later with new information, or this particular episode focuses on this background detail that we didn't know, and we finally learned this secret we've been wondering about for a few episodes, that kind of thing.
And I think that kind of works for audiences in a way that I've found with a lot of short story collections I've read. I have a lot of the stories that I love, and then I find some that I don't. But if there's a story that's not necessarily connecting with me, I know it's going to change up, pretty soon. So stick with it because there might be something I love coming up. And so I think most of the stories in here were really great, but that does afford the audience the assurance of just keep going. There's more opportunities.
Keep going, there might be one. Yeah, I figured it really gave me. I really liked the fact that as I began to give it to beta readers, all the beta readers would have like a different favorite. Like, well, I think that's good then. That means that, yeah, like, okay, if everyone said it's the same one, or if everyone told me that, I would always ask them what their least favorite one was too. If everyone had the same least favorite or the same favorite, then I knew I was in trouble and I need to cut something. But I never got the same answers. So, yeah,
that's good. Each chapter has a new magical creature, or maybe a different variation of a magical creature. And it was interesting because I was always on the lookout for it, because I started to notice the pattern that there's a new magical creature. I was like, all right, when's it gonna come in? And if we start getting through it, I'm like, oh no, that means it has to come in at the wrong time. But what was that? Did you draw from other magical creatures, or were you trying to create as much originality with them as possible?
Well, both. I didn't want to make it feel like I was drawing from a monster manual ever. If I were to create something strange and weird or terrifying, or even occasionally wondrous, because there are some things that aren't quite as terrifying sometimes, I wanted it to feel legitimately like some alternate version of the Mediterranean might have had this. Like, this thing wouldn't have been completely out of step with something that you'd have heard of some hero in ancient Greek or Roman myth encountering, So that's the vibe I tried to approach for that. And also, I didn't want to have the same kind of creature or have the same impact. If there's a magical element in one story, it might be front and center. The magical one in the next, I didn't want it to turn into like monster of the week, right? So sometimes a magical element might be very small. Sometimes it might be central. Sometimes it might be attached to this facet. Sometimes it might be terrifying. Sometimes it might be helpful.
That and on that note, it is interesting that there are magical elements here, but it doesn't read like magic systems that we have in modern fantasy. So many modern fantasy authors, that is like the point. They're like, you can't have a new modern fantasy without having like a really complex, really interesting magical system. And I, for one, that's my least favorite part of fantasy, is the magic systems, because it means I have to like really focus on understanding that, and it takes away from the plot, the characters, the general world building, and the themes. And so I liked that this one, it was more subdued and there were fantastical creatures, but it was much more of like a soft magic system in that sense. Was that conscious on your part, or were you not focused on magic at all?
No, that's absolutely conscious on my part. I have respect for people that do that. I really do. I How to say this? So I'm a little bit bored by it anymore, frankly. I just want to get on with the story. I don't want to stop and tell you how the magic system works. I want to show you the story. And you'll notice that none of my major characters are magical users, so they're not going to be inclined to tell you.
Right.
They might theorize occasionally about, well, why this is happening, but they're not going to be able to break it down. The other thing is that in myth and legend, this stuff really wasn't well organized. And finally, the old school sword and sorcery that I grew up reading, magic was almost always bad. Occasionally someone good might use it, but it wasn't something you could control very well, and it's highly dangerous. Very, very dangerous. Maybe there's rules, but maybe the rules don't always work right.
Yep, I do. And it definitely has that kind of old school sword and sorcery. Even the cover really reminded me of it specifically reminded me of those Robert Jordan Conan novels from the 80s that Tor published. It really seemed like that. And one person online said was this book from the 80s? And I was like, no, it just has a that nice classic feel to it. Because so many modern covers are boring. So I applaud Bain for giving it a great cover. Did you have any input on the cover design, or
Not
was that?
not really. That's the work of the talented Dave Seeley. And I did suggest a scene from several of the stories, and that's a scene from the first story. I had also
Right.
suggested, that big battle with the gladiators in this fourth story.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but maybe that was too much. We wouldn't want people thinking, oh, this is just a. I wouldn't want people picking and think, oh, this is historical fiction. Those are clearly Romans, right? So I think
Mhm.
that's why they went with more of the vibe from the first one.
Yeah, you get the historical fiction nature in the book 2 cover. So
Yeah, yeah,
they you got best of both worlds there.
that's right.
Um uh so were there any sometimes authors are intentional and they have a book or books that they really, that inspired them when they're writing their fantasy. Did you have any like that, whether it's with this book or just your books in general, that you're like, this is the book or books that you can point to and say, I'm either trying to emulate this, or this was the author that I read a lot that I appreciated? Do you have anything like that?
Oh, absolutely. So the most recent thing I did for St. Martin's was Ringsworn, and that was a love letter to the original Chronicles of Amber by Roger Zelazny.
Yeah,
My
yeah.
heart on my sleeve for that, at least the original series. I kind of liked the second series, but the first one narrated by Corwin. Uh,
Hmm.
when I was a young man, I read that, I don't know, 8 or 9 times, probably a bunch of times. And this one's a little bit more obscure, but it makes sense. I mean, obviously, I was fascinated with Hannibal, and I first read of Hannibal because a wonderful biography by a historian named Harold Lamb. And it turns out I liked that book so much that I went and read more books by Harold Lamb, and I discovered these wonderful old swashbuckling historical adventure stories. Um, and these were originally written, I think the first one was 1917, and he wrote them for about, I don't know, 6, 7 years, and they flow incredibly naturally one into the next, although he never intended them for publication because in that way, because they were all in the pulp magazines.
Yep.
And they read very much like a miniseries where each one stands alone, but characters can return and things build forward. The only thing he couldn't do, not imagining it ever for publication, was build toward a season climax.
Hmm.
So he was an incredible inspiration to me on two fronts. One was the super interconnected way. I mean, you look at Lankmar, you look at Conan, uh, and there is connection, but one was done by other hands, and the other one was done sort of later in life by Fritz Leiber. So it's not as connected as I think either might have wanted it to have originally been. So, but Lamb had it connected that way. So I'd say Lamb, both for introducing me to Hannibal and for allowing me to showing me how to interconnect them. And you'll see that I dedicated the book to him.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I do remember that now. The book has themes about, self-sacrifice and also about revenge, but they also, one of the chapters, I won't say which one, but one of the chapters has a great sequence on forgiveness that I really appreciated, because so many revenge type stories, they're so like depressing, and because the author is trying to convey that revenge is sometimes bad, or usually bad, but they do that by making the character go so far into revenge that they get depressed. Whereas there was a character that our main character gives forgiveness to, and it was just really touching. Was that from the beginning of the narrative, or did you place that in not knowing it would happen until you got to that chapter?
Well, that's a complex question. It requires a complex answer. I did not want it to mostly be about revenge. Hanavar has incredible reasons to be angry, and I try to show that he has that anger, but that he doesn't pursue it.
Yeah.
it he doesn't have time to pursue it. He's more interested in saving people. Revenge isn't going to help anything at all.
Hmm.
So even though he's very angry. And so I did want to eventually tell a story that was kind of showcasing forgiveness in a way. And as I developed it, that came along. I didn't know exactly how I was going to do it from the very beginning, but
Hmm.
and I like that. Yeah, it's about duty and responsibility. I see so much fiction anymore where the characters a snarky person learning their way into their power, and they're kind of resistant to kind of resistant to doing the right thing. Maybe they'll get talked into it, or maybe they're just sort of dark and dirty to begin with, and they sort of reluctantly end up doing the right thing. I wanted to write a story about a guy. No question, he knows what he needs to do, and he's going to go do it. He expects he'll probably die trying, but he's going to do it anyway.
Were there any ideas that the editorial team at Bain suggested when you were working on the book? Did they have anything that shaped the book, or did it generally keep the same overall feel when they edited it?
No, it was they edited with an incredibly light hand. It was mostly looking for typos and things. They were incredibly receptive and supportive of my vision for Hannibal and the books. Yeah, I couldn't have asked for more encouraging. Like, yes, I like it. Send me more. Actually, I think they said, yes, I love it. I need more.
That seems to be the theme with Bane, is that they tend to be focused on, we love your story, we want to help you get more, not so much of, we like your ideas, but we want them to fit our ideas. So they're
Right.
very open to, it's your story, we just want to give you advice. So that's really nice. So my next question really gets into the weeds of publishing. It specifically is about the publishing plan for book 2, which is titled The City of Marble and Blood. This is, of course, going to be the follow-up to book 1, but it's scheduled to release in October of 2023. I just find this really fascinating because it's a really fast turnaround from publication. At least from my experience observing these things, typically books are published about 9 to 12 months apart between sequels. So you may have one come out a year, maybe 2 if there's a special circumstance. The only times I've seen it otherwise are with Star Trek books, where they publish a trilogy month to month to month because they have the built-in audience, or with something like Naomi Novik. She wrote 3 of her fantasy books back to back and then started working on the rest. Do you know why Bain decided to release these 2 books so close together?
Not entirely. I think they wanted to reassure audiences that, yes, this is a new series, and yes, it's not going to take forever to get out. Right. And also, I mean, they had the books, because while I was, while book 1 was being shopped around and while Bain had it under consideration, I just went ahead and wrote the second one. Maybe that was goofy of me, but I loved the character so much. I just went ahead and wrote the second one. And, I'm revising the third one. I hope to have the third one turned over by the time book 2 is out.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not looking at a long production schedule. And I think they want to make sure that their audience understands that with Howard Jones, you're not going to be waiting years and years and years between the book. Hopefully you're not even going to be waiting, more than a year before the third one comes
Mm-hmm.
out. The fourth one ought to be right behind it.
That's one of the things I enjoy about the author Kevin J. Anderson, is whenever he's writing fantasy, he'll write a trilogy, and then his pitch for it is, do you want a completed fantasy series? I've got a completed fantasy series for you. And so
Right.
he's trying to prove to the audience, I'm no George Martin, I'm no Patrick Rothfuss. I'm going to finish everything up. So that's just fascinating to me, because if Bain feels confident about it, that's great. I would feel a little nervous about it, because that's a quick turnaround time.
Well, it is.
Uh,
It finds me. So I'm promoting a new book
right.
with book 1, a new series with a new publisher, and then 2 months later, I'm pretty much going to be promoting for 2 months straight. But I also need to be revising the
Right.
third one, so I'm juggling a lot of balls right now. Fortunately, I'm having a lot of fun doing it.
That's good. Yeah, I know you're going to some conventions, and that anytime I go to a convention, it wipes me out,
Oh,
and
right.
I feel the workload is just so much that I can't do anything else when I'm at the convention. So,
Absolutely. Gen Con will keep me busy. And I'll be going to Dragon Con for a few days at the end of August.
ooh, yay, that's fantastic. I'm gonna go to Dragon Con too. So
I
I'll
saw that. So hopefully we'll meet in person at some point.
yeah. So the next question I have is, so you talk about, you've written other books as well. If people enjoy this one, can you kind of give a little bit of a pitch for some of your other books, and maybe where you can find them?
Oh, sure. Well, there were 4 through Pathfinder, and that's 2 sets of 2. So that's the Pathfinder role-playing game.
Yep.
Uh, and the first 2 are a little bit more traditional, although they hired me to lean heavy on the sword and sorcery part. So they're a little less gamey and more sword and sorcery. And then the
Mm-hmm.
second 2 are set down in the tropics, and I got to leave even more of the gamey tropes out of the way. I don't even think I barely mention elves or halflings. It's mostly about lizard folk and adventuring and archaeology and stuff. I had a lot of fun with those. But the main creator-owned books I wrote, so there were two other series for St. Martin's. The first was an Arabian fantasy series. I've heard it described as kind of like Sinbad crossed with Indiana Jones or Sherlock Holmes crossed with
Ooh.
the Arabian Nights. And there's only
Okay.
two of those. And then there's a collection of short stories. But the first one's called The Desert of Souls. That's sort of the origin story. And the second one is The Bones of the Old Ones. And then there's a collection of short stories called The Waters of Eternity. And my God, I must have 8 or 10 short stories that I need to collect. What I really ought to do is finish writing 2 or 3 more, so I have a nice sizable collection of those, and so then there'd be 4. And I think I already described the Ringsworn trilogy, right? My love
Right.
letter to Roger Zelazny, and that's complete. You know, there's your trilogy. We were just talking.
That's great. So you've got quite a lot under your belt. So you're new to Bain, but not new to publishing. So you know how
Yes,
to
sir.
do all this. So the last question I have for you is, do you have a website or a blog or a social media account or anything where people can find you to find out more information on your books and your appearances and stuff like that?
Sure, sure. And you're right. You remind me that I need to update my blog more often. I just dropped in last night to put up my Gen Con schedule and realized I hadn't put anything in there since March. But
Yeah.
that's what happens when you get busy writing. So yeah, my website's real easy. It's howardandrewjones.com. And even though it's not as active these days, there are years and years and years worth of blogs about writing. I did a whole lot of posts about writing, craft writing, how I got started, all of that stuff. And of course, there's links so you can see all the pretty pictures of my books, and you can see a little bit about my creative process. And occasionally, I'll gas on about some cool thing I liked, some book I read, or some show I watched, or some game I played. Uh, Bay has got me back on Twitter. I'm not really a huge Twitter fan. As a matter of fact, I think a couple of years went by before I said much, between when I said much anything. But they've got me back on just in time for Twitter to be dying and changing its name. But you can find me there every few days saying something or other. I'm at Howard Andrew John. And then I maintain a Facebook presence because there's a couple of old used books services and stuff like
Mhm.
that there that I really enjoy. And I think my handle is howardandrewjones.1 probably. If not, just search for the Howard Andrew Jones who prints books, and that'll probably be me.
Gotcha. That sounds great. So the book Lord of a Shattered Land is out. It's in hardcover and it's an ebook. And then of course, as we mentioned, book 2, City of Marble and Blood, comes out in October. You can get them from Bain Books. But Mr. Jones, thank you so much for doing this interview with me.
Hey, I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
All right. And to our audience, you have a wonderful day.